Hi everybody, welcome to Painting with Daniel. My name is Daniel Tate and I work at the Longview Public Library. I'm excited to make these painting lesson videos for you and I hope that you have a lot of fun watching them. If you get the chance to paint along with me, well, I hope you have a lot of fun doing that too. So today we're going to start with watercolor and I'm going to go over the materials I'll be using. I'll introduce you to some basic watercolor techniques, and then we'll sketch up the painting that we're going to start next week in lesson number 2. So let's get into it. Alright, let's go over the materials that I'm going to be using. I have my assistant here. This is Ghost the kitty cat. He's going to help me out. We're going to start with watercolor paper. So I'm going to be using this Strathmore watercolor paper. What makes watercolor paper special is that it's a heavier, thicker paper, and so as you get water and watercolor paint on there, it's not going to bend or warp as much. It stays flatter as you work with it. Alternatives to this would be if you have a sketchbook or drawing paper or cardstock, that's usually heavier, thicker paper that will work well. If all you've got is printer or copier paper, go ahead and try it out. It is going to bend and warp on you a lot quicker as it gets more watercolor and water on it. So just be aware of that. But we're just here to have fun and experiment and play around. So there's nothing wrong with using what you've got. I'll be using that Strathmore watercolor paper. And I can tear a sheet out of that pad and then cut it to whatever size I want so that I can then tape that down with masking tape. So I've got this roll of masking tape here. That's what I'll use to tape it onto my surface. And then the surface I will be using is this Gator Board here. So this Gatorfoam material, it's light, it's a hard, flat surface. You can see these impressions here where I've stapled watercolor paper on, which is something nice you can do with the Gator Board is reuse staples. There's nothing wrong with masking tape though. That's what I'll be using for these watercolor lessons. Now I don't expect anyone else to have Gator Board with them, so alternatives to that would be if you have an old piece of plywood or masonite. Those are nice to use, doesn't have to be very big. Any kind of hard, flat surface is what we're looking for, so it could be the lid to a big Rubbermaid container, or you can get creative with that. If you don't mind it getting some watercolor paint on there or maybe even ruined, so don't use anything that you want to keep in good condition. But if you have an old coffee table, an old desk, an old TV tray, something that you don't mind getting watercolor or paint on or tape or any kind of way it could be damaged or ruined, those can be good alternatives as well. So if you just have an old coffee table lying around or an old desk that's already dinged up and damaged, that can be a good surface to tape your watercolor painting down onto. Next, we have the watercolors themselves, and I have this little clamshell pan of Winsor and Newton watercolor paints. So often you'll see these paint sets, these watercolor paint sets where they're longer. A lot of times that's something you'll get for school is a set of watercolor paints, and it's in a longer style kind of pan set of watercolors. And these are nice because you'll have the watercolors on one side, so they're in these little these little squares here. And then on this side, this is where I can mix colors. So that's what's nice about these pan sets is you have a side to hold your paint and a side to mix your paint. And over here you can see I've already mixed a bunch of colors. I can use a brush, get it wet, and wake those up and reuse them again if I want to. Or if I want to start fresh, I could clean this off with a paper towel or old rag or something, get that wet, and I could wipe this up and make it nice and clean if I want to start from scratch. One of the nice things about watercolor though is that if it dries up, it can be reused. You can wake that up with some water with a wet brush and reuse that paint again. So this is my watercolor pan set. Watercolor does come in tubes, so you may have watercolor tubes. Those you'll just squeeze that out and then use that like you would a regular hard cake pan set of watercolor like that one. And then as that tube watercolor dries, you can just reuse that as well. It'll dry out and it'll get hard, and then you can just wake it up again with water with your wet brush. Then you'll need some kind of container, and I have this old glass here that I've been using, and this is what you'll fill up with water, and then you'll get your brush wet and mix paint and go back and clean out your brush. So kind of like the surface, we want something that we don't mind if it gets damaged or dirty or get paint on it. So I just have this designated glass here. Feel free to use an old salsa jar or pasta sauce jar or Cool Whip container or something like that. Obviously you don't want it to have Cool Whip in it or salsa in it. You want to clean that out and then have clean water in there for when you're watercolor painting. And that is something I'd like to mention, is that you want to use cold or cool water when you watercolor paint. At least as a start, I recommend that when you're learning and beginning. Warm or hot water, that really excites the paint and it gets runnier. It's harder to predict what's going on or what is going to happen when you put the paint down on there, which can be fun to play around with and definitely a technique worth exploring. But if you're just starting out, cold or cool water is going to give you more control, and so that's what I'll be using. And you'll notice as you mix paint and as you keep going back and cleaning out your brush, that water in your container is going to start to get very colorful and then muddy and murky, and so you want to dump it out and put some clear, new, fresh water in that container, so that way you aren't bringing colors that you don't intend to into your painting. If you have clean, fresh water in there often, then you're going to have more control over your colors as well. And then we will talk about brushes. So these are watercolor brushes. They, because they're watercolor brushes, they're usually softer and more absorbent bristles, so you can really get a lot of water in them, load them up with paint. That's what they're meant to do, is to accept a lot of water and paint. And I have a variety of sizes and brush shapes, and that's something that's nice if you do have a bunch of different brushes. So that way if you do something, a big area, you'll have a big brush to cover it with. If you have details, you'll have a smaller brush to work with. So a variety of brush sizes is nice. If you just have any brushes, go ahead and try them, go ahead and use them. My recommendation is that if you use brushes for watercolor, you keep them for watercolor, because you don't want to start using acrylic or tempera or oil or something, and then that can harden and ruin your watercolor brushes, where if you just use watercolor with these brushes, you can use them for a long time if you clean them out after each session and just run them under tap water and run the brushes between, or the bristles in between your finger some to help get some of that water out. Once they're nice and clean, they'll be as good as new. So if you use them for watercolor, keep them that way. Finally, you just need some kind of pencil to sketch out the painting you're going to make. I have this F pencil here. It doesn't have to be a fancy, that's not what the F stands for, but it doesn't have to be a fancy drawing pencil like this. A number 2 or mechanical or whatever will work just fine. This F pencil is nice because it is a lighter kind of graphite. It's a hard graphite, so it draws lightly, and that's helpful if you need to erase or you don't want that pencil to show in the final product, but just drawing lightly with the number 2 pencil is fine. All right, so those are the materials we're going to use, and next we're going to get into setup and then some basic watercolor techniques. Okay, we are ready to paint. As you can see, I have my watercolor paper here taped down, so I've used that masking tape to create kind of a border around there. So now this paper is sealed and on my Gator board, so it's ready to go. And I've got my paint here. I have my little case open, ready to go. I've got my water right here, so it's filled with cool water. And then I have my brushes handy. So we're just going to look at some techniques here. And I'm going to start with this big brush here just to show you. Get it wet here, and then I'm just going to paint just water on here. So not seeing any color because all I'm doing is putting water onto my paper. And then I'm going to go back into my water container with my brush, and I'm going to get some red here just to show you. So where I've put that water down, if I just touch it here, you can see it's starting to blossom there. So something like that is a technique called WetInWet. So when the paper's already wet and we get a wet brush loaded with color, put it down, we have WetInWet. You can see it blooms. We can push that around and add more. I can even get my brush, put some more water in there, load it up with color, and then drop it in again. Now you can see the difference between that kind of WetInWet and if I just put it down where there isn't any water. You can see how it's blossoming, this kind of reticulation around the edges here, versus where it was just dry paper and how it's much kind of cleaner brush stroke right there. Okay, so I'm going back into the water and I'll show you this. So I'm just kind of using the side of my container here and the brush to just try and get a lot of that paint out. You can see now my water is starting to turn kind of an orange color, and if I get even more color in there and it starts to become more opaque where you can't see through it, that's when I'll probably want to dump it out and put some clean water in there. So I'm going to show you what's called a wash. So you can do WetInWet with this, or you can start with loading it up. So I'm loading up my brush here with blue watercolor. And washes are good for big areas, like if you want to do a sky where you're putting a lot of color down somewhere. So if I wanted to do a sky, I could start with, you can see right here, because the water's not totally clean, I'm getting a little orange and blue mix, so it's kind of a greenish color right there. That's okay. I'm putting my paint down, and if I just keep pulling it down like that, I can make it nice and even if I want to. I could have a nice even blue sky. If that's too light, I can just go back in the water, load up my brush with more blue paint, more blue watercolor, and go back in. I can push this around, even it out, or if I want more blue in one area, I can put more loaded up water there. You can see right here where that pigment, where the color blue is collecting, it's going to be darker right there. If I don't want that, if I want it to be more even, I can go back into my water. So I'm just doing the same thing to get that out of my brush. And this is just water. There's no blue in there. So I can just kind of vacuum that up almost with my brush. So that's kind of a small wash right there. I could cover this whole piece of paper with blue paint if I wanted to, or whatever area I wanted to have that blue sky on. Now, another technique, and I'm going to switch brushes here. First, I'm going to clean out my brush a little bit. And what I like to do is I kind of use my fingers to squeegee out some of that excess water. Very gently though, I'm not crushing the brush head here. I'm just kind of squeegeeing it out a little bit. And then I can set that aside. Since it is wet, you might want to set it on paper towels or newspaper or something, or if you have anything you can set it on that you don't mind getting some watercolor on. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. So I'm going to switch to this brush here. Nice kind of medium-sized brush. And I'm going to show you dry brush. Dry brush is a really, for me at least, selective technique. It's something if I want to show texture, like for grass, something like that, I might do dry brush. And dry brush is really getting a lot of pigment, so I just have water on this brush right now. But if I put a lot of pigment on here and then go onto the paper, it's going to come off dry, and you're going to see a lot more of the color than you are the water. So I'm just loading this up here. You can see I'm just kind of twirling my paintbrush. And you can see it's pretty nice and green on there. With dry brush too, you could even fan out the brush a little bit if you wanted to. Again, all gently, not trying to hurt the brush. And then go on there like that. You can see I can see those strands of the brush on there. And that can be a nice textural technique. So that's dry brush, when it's a lot more watercolor or pigment on your brush. And same thing, since I've painted with watercolor a fair amount, I just get used to it. Anytime I put water or paint down, I just go right back into my container and I clean my brush out for whatever I'm going to do next. You'll notice too, when I'm cleaning my brush out, it's kind of hard to see from this angle, but I don't dunk the whole brush, like I wouldn't go down into it. I want to stay where the brush is and not down into this ferrule. That's this part of the brush where the bristles are usually glued into here, so they stay together. If you stay out of that, so just the bristles get into the water, your brush is going to last longer because that water is not going to get up into that glue and start to loosen it over time. So I'm always staying just cleaning the brush, not getting any water up into that area there. Okay, nice and clean. You can see as this paint's starting to dry, it's starting to do some fun things. This wet and wet area here is really starting to soften. You can see this nice area, it's just very gentle, very soft. Right here where I did kind of a regular loaded up with some pigment where there wasn't water before, it's still very crisp, and you can see how dark it is here, and then it lightens up as that brush was losing paint as I moved across. So by the time I got here, there wasn't a whole lot of pigment left in the brush. It all started here. All right. And this is a good time too to just play around with mixing colors. So I'll just use this area here. You can see I'm just vacuuming up all of that green. Let's say I wanted to make this a darker green. So I've woken that area up. That pigment's ready to go. Play around with, first I'll put some more green in here. Actually, let's make it a lighter green. Let's try that. So I got this green here, and you usually aren't going to use white with watercolor because the paper that you're using is white, and so If you use more water than you are the pigment, than you are the watercolor paint, that white's going to show through. So the paper's doing the work for you. Example of this. So I have that green there. Putting the green down. Cleaning my brush out, getting more water. And then if I just keep adding water to it, it's lightening up. So it's being more translucent. That green is now a light green. So the paper's doing the work for me. I don't need to have any white watercolor. And you often won't find that in the watercolor sets that you get. But you can go darker. So I'm taking this green, and if I were to add, I'll show you here. So you can see this yellow here. Well, some of the yellow. It has green in it. And that's because I was probably wanting more of a yellow green, and so I was taking my green here and mixing it into my yellow. When you have these light, warm colors, especially yellow, kind of a gold here, it's kind of light brown. If you're mixing darker colors into that, you want to be careful with watercolor because you're going to pull that into your yellows or your golds. So sometimes you almost even have to clean that out first. And you could put that down over on your palette, or you could put it on paper since we're just playing around here, or you could wash your brush off with that. But now this is going back to yellow. And so that way, if I wanted to have a yellow-green, see where I started this yellow here, I'm going to mix my dark color into my lighter color. And yellow really is the main culprit here, where it's going to pick up reds or blues, any of that you mix into it. So now I want to add my green, and I'm not adding it to, I'm not going to add it to my yellow pigment here. I'm going to add it up to my yellow here. So now you can see more of a yellow-green, and my true yellow here in my case is going to stay yellow. It's not going to have that green dragged into it. So that's a little tip for keeping your mixing on your palette here, or the wax paper, or whatever you're using, and being careful about not dragging those darker colors around. And some of that will just happen. You can see where I've gotten sloppy, how that yellow had green in it, or where the red had some blue in it. And that's okay. You can clean that off. Going back into my water container here. Okay. And so if I want to get something that's much darker, it's really just loading it up with pigment, adding purples, adding blues. If I want to have a dark green, I can go to this green here and keep pulling purple into it. It's a constant kind of push and pull between how much water you're using and how much pigment or watercolor paint you're adding to it. So I'm going in here to clean it out, pulling in more purple. Looking at it, it's still pretty watery. And then I'll take some of this green, mix it in there. And now you can see that's almost like a gray green. But even then it's light because of how much water I'm using. If I keep mixing that, so keep adding purples, keep pulling in green, Go back into that. More pigment, looking even darker now. So with areas like this, where you add more water and do something like a wash, you can see it's starting to warp. So if I push that down, you can see the water. And that's where if you're using something like copy paper, a lighter, thinner paper, that kind of warping or buckling, that's going to happen much faster. Even this watercolor paper, it's going to happen, but if I wait an hour, couple hours, this will calm down and it may not go entirely flat again, but it will be much more flat where I can start working with that area again. There are other fun things you can do while it's wet like this. Sprinkling salt into it, that can almost make this snowy effect where the salt starts absorbing that watercolor. You can go back in, like I'll take this little brush, this clean brush, and I can just pull that paint around. Because it's just sitting there. So I'm not even touching my watercolors over here. I'm just going into what's on there. And I can continue to push that around. If I go in here and add water, I can start to lighten it up again. Now there is a technique using toilet paper where you can press that onto the wet watercolor and lift it out so that the toilet paper will absorb the watercolor and the pigment and pull it off of the paper. Since since toilet paper is at a premium right now, you may not have much toilet paper that you want to use for your watercolor painting. But that is something to think about because that can kind of act like an eraser, can pull things off and get the paint that's on your paper back to white, or if something goes on too dark, you can pull it back off. The reason that toilet paper is often used is because it's not going to leave any residue, or something like a tissue, a Kleenex, that will often leave little paper particles on there. And then if you try to work around that, you'll have these tiny little kind of chunks in there. So toilet paper just happens to be the type of paper that doesn't leave any residue behind. But again, that's not something that many of us will want to use when we're playing around with watercolor at the moment. So those are the building block kind of techniques. We have wet and wet. We have just regular brush strokes, loading it up with water and pigment. We have doing washes, where you can start by a wet and wet technique, laying the water down, and then adding your pigment, or you can start with the pigment. And then we have some dry brush here. And then otherwise, it's just playing around with the watercolor, pushing that water around, adding pigment. You can see my water, now that it's full of greens and purples and oranges, it's starting to look a little swampy. So I'll take this, I would dump it out and add some fresh, clean water in there if I want to keep going. Otherwise, I'm always going to have this little tinge of this kind of greenish purple color to it. These techniques, it's definitely worth playing around, mixing colors, seeing what you can come up with, getting used to the idea of the paper being your white, and so you're layering colors on there. Those are things we're going to keep talking about as we keep working with watercolor painting. And working light to dark is also something that's pretty unique about watercolor, because that's really the only way you can do it. You can't really go back to light too much other than that lifting technique I talked about with using toilet paper. But even that, you're only going to be able to get the paper so white before the paper itself is going to start to get damaged. So you have to work light to dark. You have to start with things being lighter and then layering on top of that. Watercolor is also a very patient process, I would say, or requires patience. Something like this where I'm waiting. See, it's still pretty wet, still pretty warped. You want to give things time, let them dry, work with, if you have a spot like this that's still wet and you still want to work with that, paint around it, use that. You'll want to do that in the moment. Otherwise, let things dry, let the paper go back to being flat. No rush with watercolor. Just let things proceed kind of in an even pace and get used to doing things a step at a time as you go forward. So now that we've played around with the watercolor a little bit and talked about some techniques, we are going to look at the image that we're going to start painting next week, but I'm going to start by showing you how I would sketch it out. So now we are going to sketch out our picture. So what we're going to be painting next week is this image right here of this hand holding some flowers. Looks like sticking through a fence of some sort. I picked this image because I like the color arrangement here with the flowers. Gives us a chance to work with a hand, something that can be kind of tricky, and then this pattern here in the background and how it goes from something that's clear looking to more blurry back here. So it should be something fun, fairly simple, but it has some complex elements that will make it a nice challenge. You can see over here, this is about a 5x7 piece of watercolor paper that I've cut out. And once again, I have used masking tape to tape this down to my Gator board. And when I tape things down, I keep in mind that when you tape it, you're creating a border on the piece. So even if I were to do a wash or cover this in paint, it's not going to go past where this tape is. So you want to think about that border you're creating. I shoot for about half tape on my surface and half on the paper itself. If it's a smaller piece like this, then I might cheat that in a little bit more so that there's not quite half the tape on this border. And if it's uneven, that's okay. Don't worry too much about that. Clean edges are nice, but it's nothing that that you should concern yourself with too much. If you made something that you were to matte later on or frame, it really won't be that apparent, and nothing's perfect. So we're just doing the best we can. I've got this on here, and then I'm going to use my pencil. This is that F pencil, but again, a number 2 will work fine. We're going to sketch it pretty lightly on here. I might press a little harder just so you can see what I'm doing, but otherwise, we'll just sketch lightly. You can have an eraser handy if you want, the eraser on the pencil, or one of those gum erasers, or a pearl eraser. But when I sketch, I do it lightly, and I just block things in generally. I don't worry too much about the details. One of the nice things with watercolor is that after you paint it, you can always go back with a pencil and draw things in again if you want to hit some details, or you want to use a marker or a pen or something like that. So with this, I'm just going to kind of locate where our main image on this picture, which is this hand holding these flowers, and just kind of looking at it, I'm gonna use this pencil as kind of the dividing line. So it's mostly on the left half. This just happens to be about the exact same size as the image here on this tablet that I'm using. So if I were to look at about halfway, so that hand and those flowers are going to exist mostly on this left half. And then just locating it again, the hand down here is lower, and then those flowers go up about right here. And that's the main thing for sketching things in. It's just blocking in the areas that they are, and just kind of using basic shapes to get that information on there. You can always erase if you're drawing lightly and you need to do that. I don't worry about things like the petals too much or anything like that. We can create that with the watercolor paint. We can make all of those darker petals in here, the shadows they're creating, highlights, things like that. We can do all of that with the paint. So I'm just going to start over here and sketch in my hand. And I'm starting with kind of the wrist here, that part of the arm going in, and then popping in that hand. I'm going to draw it as though the hand, I can see that part under that leaf here. So I'm making that shape of the hand. So I've blocked that in. And I'll go over this darker as I sketch things in there. One of the nice things, if you start lightly and you want to go in darker, you can then come back in and erase just the lighter marks that you've made with your pencil. So now I'm going to pop in that bottom part of those flowers right here, and then I'm going to get these leaves. And so looking at it again, you can see this leaf almost goes to the tip, or almost getting kind of close to where the end of that arm is. So use that as my guide, something like that. And something I always keep in mind is that no one's going to look at the piece you've made and then look up the image that it came from. This image came from a website that has free images to use, so we're not using it for any commercial reason or anything like that, but it's free. We're also creating a new version of it, so it's not going to be the exact same thing, so we don't have to worry about that. But no one's going to look this up and compare it to whatever piece you end up making, so don't concern yourself too much with trying to match it exactly and make it this perfect copy, because that's really not what painting's all about. We're not just trying to make a copy. We're making our own version, and we're having fun with it. So I've got this leaf, and then you can see there's a leaf here that's kind of curling towards us. So I might kind of pop that shape in like so. And again, where the leaf is darker here, that's something that we can put in when we paint. So I don't really need to draw that kind of detail in there. And then we have this leaf coming out. And then finally, we have this big leaf kind of popping up and curling like that. Okay, so I pretty much have my leaf shapes sketched in here, the bottom of this. Now I have 3 flowers, so I'm going to pop those in. So we have one that goes up like this, and these two, they're kind of overlapping on there. So I'm going to go up like that, and I'm just going to kind of add this line here to represent that one. This one, this yellow flower is closer to us, so I'm going to kind of pop in that shape. And I'm really just doing a shorthand for these petals right here, which are just these kind of curly lines here. And then getting that general shape like that. I mean, it almost looks like a cloud. So this one, this orange one back here, seems a little bit kind of spikier, so I'll do kind of a shorthand for that. And then this red one, finally. It's got this one petal. It's kind of reaching out. Like that. So I might add that one in. It's kind of a nice little touch. And so now I have the basic kind of shape. It's not perfect. I'm not too worried about that. I might go in and I can see that these stems here go a little further down. Maybe I'll add that in. But this stem is behind that leaf. So I'll close this off on my drawing. And then I might come in here and just continue that petal pattern a little bit. This will help me when I paint, just kind of guide me to how I'm going to include those different colors where it's more of a yellow and more of a gold. And I could do that on some of these leaves if I wanted as well. Like how this leaf kind of has this subtle line going up like that. All right, and then it's kind of important for this hand to show these knuckles right here, because that's where our shadows are going to be. It's where the tone is going to be darker, and then there's highlights on these knuckles. So I might go in here and just kind of sketch those out a little bit more. I've got this finger down here that I've made, and then we have one knuckle here, one knuckle here, and then seeing that knuckle, and just a little kind of sliver of the thumb. Might include that. And then you can see some of that finger. Actually, you can see both of those fingers, so I might include some of that information on here. And it don't worry about perfection. You can see this is just a real kind of general sketch. And you'd be amazed when you paint something, when you create art, that really suggesting things is just as good as making them highly detailed and refined. And that's something that it just takes time to make those details and to make things refined like that. Suggesting things, having them be loose, that's really what watercolor is all about. And that really helps you harness your voice, the way you make watercolor. And that's something I recommend doing is allowing yourself to be loose, allowing yourself to improvise. So that way, if I don't put every single detail in here, well, then I get to play with the paint when I get to that point. Okay, so this is pretty good for the flowers and the hand. I'm satisfied with where I'm at for that. That's a lot of information right here. I'm going to come in and just make some of that a little darker, just so you all can see it better. So I'm just going over these lines here, especially the major outlines. I probably wouldn't do this on my piece that I was working on, but just so you all can see what I've done. And pencil and watercolor does have a really nice effect. I do like how that looks. You'll often see pencil and watercolor used together. And it can be a nice conversation of drawing beforehand, painting some, going back in to draw. You can get in a really quite lovely rhythm that way. Okay. So now you can hopefully see what I've drawn better. And that looks pretty good compared to that. So the last thing that we really need to pop in here are these lines. And so one trick you can do if you're drawing and you already have some pencil down, you can put a piece of paper underneath your hand, and that way you won't smudge what you've already drawn. And let's see if I have a piece of paper handy. Okay, I do. So I just have this coupon magazine. So if I put this down, it's going to create a barrier where I'm not going to, with my hand, which can smudge that pencil, I can set this down over it, and then I can start drawing here, and I don't have to worry as much about smudging or picking up or whatever with this pencil that I've already put down. So now I'm going to put some of these lines in, and I can see that this is kind of the most important line right here, the one that meets the hand. So there is a line, and I've already drawn some of it, you can see right here. So I'm just going to continue that. Like so. So now you can see in my drawing, it even looks like the hand is starting to peek out of that. And with this pattern here, it's really kind of a dark line, light line, dark line, light line. So when I draw this in, that is going to be a light line. And then I'll show you if I draw this next line in. And just so you can see what I'm talking about, I'll kind of scratch into here like this. So it's going to continue that pattern, light line, dark line. And that's what I've got here, light line, dark line. So then the next, this would be a light line. And then this is a little wider than what's over here, but that's okay. I'm just going to draw in my own new line, but I want to continue that pattern. So this is dark, light, and then this will be dark. And so that's going to be the pattern. I don't have to worry about this because since it is going to be dark, I'll be painting that in anyway. And then it's the same, it continues that same pattern here. I'm just looking at the thickness of these lines and trying to kind of match that. So something like that. It's okay if these aren't perfectly straight. You could, if you're not confident in your lines, you could get a ruler out to do this. I could even use the edge of this magazine if I wanted to. I'm not too worried about that. If you look closely at these lines, they aren't perfectly straight. So I'm just going to keep drawing these in, not perfectly straight. And something that I love about art is that it really gives you time and a space to try things that you're unsure about or that are maybe intimidating, because there's really there's nothing wrong with not getting there or not doing it perfectly. It's a painting. You can always restart. And usually when you don't do it perfectly right the first time, you're going to learn a lot from that. And if you keep trying, if you keep trying to push through that, often that you're going to find that you're capable of a lot more than you think you might be, and you're going to do some stuff that surprises you, and you're going to grow from that. And that's a really important experience with art. So I can see that this line, this is a little funky, so I might kind of bulk it up a little bit. And again, when I go in to paint all this, you're not going to see the pencil. It's going to be dark enough where you won't. I might continue this, it looks like, about to where the flowers are. You can see that's where you can still make out these lines. Once it hits that halfway point, so once it gets there, these lines get so blurry on this side that I'm really not going to worry about that. I can create all of that with my painting. Drawing them in is just not necessary. So I'm just going to keep popping in these lines. Something that's also important to note is that the lines seem to get closer together and a little bit thinner as they go along. But they aren't, it's not a perfect pattern. This line is thinner right here. This line is pretty thick. So there are some outliers in there. So I'm going to keep that in mind. I'm not counting the lines. I'm not too worried about that level of accuracy. Again, no one's going to pull up this image and compare the two, and I'm just not worried about that. This is my piece now that I'm working on, so I get to own it. I get to make it however I want. And if I wanted to do it again, I could do that too. Okay. So I'm just drawing these in. I'm going to keep my pattern up. So every other one is dark. And then I'm going to make this a thin one. So these lines are closer together, but they are still dark. And then this one's wider apart. And then this is also going to be close together. You can see I'm not drawing into my hand or my flowers. I'm leaving those alone. Okay. And then got another one. And another one. I'm just making sure that if I start a line down here, I try to continue it up here, and I'm really just eyeballing where it should go. I might as well shade this in. And then I'm going to make this one a lot wider. And then I'll make this one thinner. And we are almost done. So that one's wide, and then we'll do this one thin. Okay, I'm gonna go over that leaf again. I'm gonna do two more. It's like an aerobics class. Two more. And done. Okay. So that looks good. We have gotten nearly to the end of the flowers. The rest of this we will just paint when we get there. But I've got this sketched in as much as I need to. So when you get this far, and don't worry about it being perfect, I might recommend having it smaller like this, just because it is practice. If you want to make a bigger drawing, go for it. That's awesome too. It's really up to you. If you do make it larger, then I would recommend having something like this, a magazine or something that you can put under your hand when you're sketching so you don't smudge and push things around. You can see this preserved it really well. And we are far enough along now where we're going to have this sketch, and we will pick up here next Thursday. So we will start from this sketch, and we will actually start to make this painting. So if you want to get this far with your sketch, then you will be ready to go. Awesome job, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I had fun. And I'll catch you next Thursday where we'll get started on that watercolor painting together. This has been Painting with Daniel, and you have been painting with Daniel.